Good afternoon. Welcome into the Senate Committee on Government Operations meeting for Thursday, February 20th. We have a number of witnesses lined up for different topics today. We're going to begin with a walkthrough of S59, an act relating to amendments to Vermont's open meeting law. Tucker Anderson is going to join us. And then at some point, Senator Hardy may be in. She's the sponsor of the bill. Since it was referred to this committee, we have received a number of requests to revise it even further, if I can use that term, along with the VHFA. We have the Vermont State Housing Authority, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, Vermont Economic Development Authority, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and I believe LURB, which is a newly constituted entity. They've all reached out with requests to at least take a look at their concerns regarding some of the provisions in what was passed. Not sure how many years ago. I was on this committee when it passed, so it's going to be within the last 8 years, 10 years. The original bill.
The original open meeting law?
And maybe older than that.
Oh, it's
Okay.
older than that.
And anyway, welcome in, Tucker.
Tucker.
Tucker will know when our open meeting law was enacted.
I want to say at least since 1973.
Oh, wow.
I
It's
seem
a lot.
seem to recall that's when the General Assembly for a one biennium period was subject to the executive session provisions, because that's the only place the General Assembly is relevant. But
So we have looked at this before, and again, every time we do, it seems we find a new entity that is requesting further revision. So I'll just let you walk through it if you want, for just the underlying portions, which would change. Well, maybe we should look at the whole thing. So, Tucker.
good afternoon. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. You have in front of you S59, which proposes to make a few amendments to Vermont's open meeting law. We will start on page 1 in section 1, which proposes some amendments to 1 VSA section 310, which contains the definitions for the open meeting law. The first definition that is amended by S59 is in subdivision 6 of that section. That's the definition of public body. This definition was first broken out into 2 new subdivisions, sub A and B. The contents of sub A are existing law, which carves out from the definition of public body councils or similar groups established by the governor for the sole purpose of advising the governor. Sub B, this is new, a carve out for annual municipal or representative town meetings. So this excludes from the definition of public body these 2 forms of annual municipal meetings. The first, I will note, has traditionally not been viewed as a public body or as a gathering that would qualify as a meeting because there is no public body involved. It is in fact a gathering of the voters, right, to perform one day the functions and duties of the voters at an annual meeting.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, you're
Is that, we would say a lot in our select board, there's a difference between having a meeting in the public versus a meeting of the public. Is that kind of the distinction here?
There's a difference between a meeting of the voters and a meeting of a public body.
Okay.
And this distinction was discussed last year during the open meeting law conversations, and I believe that's how this proposal came to be, was on the heels of that discussion. The way that I presented testimony previously is that annual meetings are not subject to the open meeting law because there is no public body involved. So there's a moderator at the sort of floor meetings that you might be familiar with in an annual meeting, but there's no public body that is calling the meeting and gathering for the purposes of the public body. Something that is included in the miscellaneous elections bill that's currently being discussed in House Government Operations right now is a similar amendment that I worked on after this. And to clarify for purposes of that bill, the annual meetings are exempted both from the definition of public body, but also from the definition of meeting. And that is because it is not a gathering of a public body, and that's slightly more clear than exempting it from the definition of a public body.
Senator Haas.
But I'm just processing.
Yeah, no, it's.
So that'll be clear.
So I thought that our town meetings or town informational meetings were actually meetings of that the select board calls them. So why is it not a meeting of the public body?
You've added something separate on there, which is an informational hearing, which is a presentation from the legislative body about the issues that will be called to question at the annual meeting. You do there have a public body that is holding.
The select board is,
Correct.
but. And why is that not true for town meeting? Because the select board has also called us, set the date, warned the meetings.
They have set the date and warned the meetings. The meeting is for the voters to vote. And
Or to discuss.
the closest thing that you have to a gathering that might be subject to the open meeting law is when you have an assembly of the voters for purposes of a floor vote. And even there, you do not have a public body or the legislative body of the municipality holding that gathering. The moderator oversees
Right.
that gathering. I do want to call out that in this subdivision B, representative town meetings are also carved out here.
Right.
And those are distinct in that you have elected representatives gathering to exercise the power of the municipality. That is not a gathering of the voters. That is likely a public body under current law. And here it is expressly carved out.
Senator Hardy, please feel free to weigh in if at
Oh.
any point you want to.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. If you want me to come, I don't want to interrupt Tucker or
Okay,
the discussion.
fine.
I'm happy to come up and give you my reasons for introducing this bill. If you want, do you want me to? I don't know.
We can finish the walkthrough. today.
Okay, I feel awkward to. Yeah, once Tucker finish and then I'll go.
And from my understanding, this at line 7 up only affects one municipality at the moment.
Currently,
Okay.
yes,
What the,
Right.
Brattleboro.
yeah. That's the only.
That's the only municipality within Marlboro.
And that adds them to the definition of a public body, takes them out.
Take it out, right?
Oh, no.
Senator Hardy.
Yeah, I know, for instance, in our hometown, we don't have a big town house, it's not huge. But we needed a new town garage. So we had to do a public meeting first, where we went over the design, went over everything with the body, the people. And then we had to do it within 25 days of the election. So we did it actually 15 days before the election. And then they were able to go in town meeting, in our town meeting and vote for it. It was on one of the bills, one of the big articles for the town meeting. You're right, the moderator took charge. We nominated the moderator. He got he took charge. The whole, as a select board set up front. We didn't really, that was my last day as a select board member. I stepped down and let another friend, a young man from our town, take over my position. But it was one of those deals that, you're right, you have that we had a public meeting ahead of time. Then we had our town meeting and it was all done from the floor. It was all right from the floor. It wasn't hybrid. It was just all done from the floor. And so your definition of a public body is that everybody that showed up at town meeting, would that be considered a public body?
No,
What
under-
is your definition? of
not
public
under
body?
current law and certainly not under the express terms contained here. So
See, that's what it is.
it's still on the page, but a public body any board, council, or commission of the state or one of its political subdivisions, any board, council, or commission of any agency, authority, or instrumentality of the state or one or more of its political subdivisions, or any committee or subcommittee of any of the foregoing boards, councils, or commissions. And then there are the two carve-outs that we just discussed. But essentially, you can think of it as any consensus building body of the state or local government.
Senator Hardy?
I was just wondering if maybe I could just do my overview about
Sure.
the thing, and then because then I don't have to be here for the whole.
Then you go back to committee.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
Sorry, Tom.
Thank you, Tucker. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
you're
thank you.
doing a fantastic
For
job.
clarifying this.
So, S59, for, those of members who are returning to the committee, three of you remember that we did a major bill last year on the open meeting law, making updates after COVID and really just changing, a lot of provisions of the open meeting law, including making this distinction between advisory bodies and making this distinction for advisory bodies, which are sort of a subset of public bodies. That bill started here in this room and went over to the other body, not to be confused, public bodies, over to the House. And so some of the provisions in this bill are sort of cleaning up some of the language that the House, and I'm going to say it, kind of messed up. So just sort of fixing some of that language. The first provision that you just were discussing with council about the annual and representative town meetings. The annual meetings, as we discussed multiple times last year, are not subject to the open meeting law in the same way because they are not meetings of the public bodies. They are meetings of the public, and as Tucker just explained. There's one different type of town meeting in the state. That's the representative town meeting. It's for the town of Brattleboro. And the town of Brattleboro reached out to me after the bill passed last year and also reached out to their senators and asked for this. So this is in here as a discussion point on behalf of the senators that represent Brattleboro. I think it deserves lots of discussion. I'm looking at a senator who I know will discuss this because it is a different type of town meeting, and one can argue both ways. You can see it as a quote unquote regular town meeting that should be included like every other town meeting, or a different type of town meeting that maybe shouldn't have that same exception. I leave it to the committee to debate and discuss and decide what they want to do about it. But that's why this is in here, is more or less at the request of the senators who represent Brattleboro.
So maybe we have Wendy Harrison in, I think, because she's in Brattleboro. Right?
Yeah, when Senator Harrison and Senator Hashim are both know about this, and their town asked for it. And so at that point, and my position, I was trying to accommodate senators. So that's why that is in there. And it certainly is up to you. Obviously, all of this is up to you to decide for the committee. But so that's that. And then the next provisions regarding the definition of undue hardship. Tucker can explain this more, but this is trying to make it more consistent with other definitions of undue hardship. So we don't have dueling definitions of undue hardship in the statutes. The next provision, which creates, it's under section 2, the right to attend meetings of public agencies. This is also some clarifying language because the House created this weird non-advisory public body as if it was something different than a public body, when in fact it is a public body. It just so, and Tucker can walk through this more, but this is sort of cleaning up some of the messy language that the House had in their version of the bill that we didn't have a chance to fix at the end of last session. Section 3 on page 4 about executive sessions. This adds, makes explicit, another purpose to go into executive session. So it's information relating to the interest rates for publicly financed loans. The reason this is in here is at the request of VEDA, the Vermont Economic Development Authority Board. So I definitely recommend having Ted Foster, who's the chair of that board, in. He's the one that explicitly talked to me about this. And he can explain a little better than I, because he obviously chairs that board, but they talk a lot about interest rates for loans. VEDA is a lending authority that makes lower interest loans available for projects in Vermont. And a lot of the people who serve on the VEDA board are they themselves bankers. And so they're actually talking about interest rates that are competing with their own banks. And they find that awkward and perhaps inappropriate to do in a public session. And they were particularly concerned once we put the requirement in about the recordings of those sessions. Prior to that, basically nobody went to their meetings. And so those discussions were technically public, but nobody saw them. But now that there's a recording, they were feeling awkward about having those conversations and essentially having conversations about competing with their own banks. So I suggested that seems like something that could be and maybe should be discussed in executive session, similar to contracts being discussed in executive session. So that's what that is. And then the effective date is the last section. I'll just say it outright. This was intended to be a vehicle for corrections for open meeting law. It is absolutely not intended to be a vehicle for everybody coming in and asking for exemptions from the open meeting law. We have already seen that when I sat in your seat, Mr. Chair. I was very, very strict about saying, no, we are not making exceptions for, specific types of entities to have exceptions to the open meeting law. The open meeting law is to make sure that public meetings are open to the public. So this is not meant to be a vehicle for, different entities, new or old, coming in and asking for those kinds of exemptions. The one thing that was in here is that the public, the annual meeting, and that's simply because it's already part of a group that, annual meetings are not public meetings of public bodies in the same sense. So I leave it to you all to use your discretion, but I just hope that you're careful about how this bill is used. And if you have another vehicle, you might leave this on the wall and use a different vehicle. So, and I'm happy to discuss that with you further, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of context, especially.
Just very quickly, because I know you got to go across the hall.
Yeah.
Were you aware of any other financial, like VEDA, you mentioned VEDA specifically. Are there other lending institutions that would be encapsulated within this or not?
That would talk about interest rates?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think, the bond bank and probably VHFA or something like that. There must be other boards that talk about interest rates. And that might be something to explore, whether it's appropriate that all discussions of interest rates.
So that may be.
But that language seems to be pretty open to others being.
Any board that would be discussing interest rates. Yeah.
Okay.
So it doesn't name VEDA because again, I didn't think it was appropriate to make exceptions for specific boards, but they're the ones who brought that to me. And it seemed like a reasonable request, and it wouldn't be exempting them from open meeting law. They are still, open meeting law would still apply. But I think there was a concern that enough members of the VEDA board would feel like it's an inappropriate thing for them to be discussing in public, that they may actually feel like they have to resign from the board because it would just put their own banks in. Yeah, so it seemed kind of pretty fair to me.
Okay.
I don't know if there are other, that's a great question. There probably are. And, you might want to check what kind of net it's being thrown with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. Nice to see you.
Thank you for
Enjoy.
doing the cleanup on.
Yeah,
Lucky
my
puppy.
pleasure. Thank you. Enjoy Tucker's company.
We always do.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ruth.
So back in the air. Or saddle, as the case may be. And I think we left off on page 2, line 7. I think that was,
That is correct. And we are ready to move on to the amendments in subdivision 9 of 1 VSA 310. We're still on page 2, starts on line 9.
Yep.
So this amends the definition of undue hardship, and you've got a great synopsis of what's happening here. These amendments are primarily intended to marry this specific language with the generally understood and judicially articulated standards for what undue hardship is in a few other areas of law, including under the Americans with Disabilities Act and similar federal laws and provisions. So a little bit of this is technical cleanup of the language that was developed in the House. Some of the more specific legal shifts that are happening here. First, it states that the undue hardship is an action that requires significant difficulty or expense that is maintaining status quo from what passed last year to the unit of government to which a public body belongs. This is to eliminate reference to entity that had existed before, to make it clear that what we're talking about here is if the public body is a select board, we are talking about the town, not the select board itself. If we are talking about a board or commission that is housed within an agency, we are talking about undue hardship for the agency, not the board or commission itself.
so right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can I give an example to see if I'm understanding you? So would the example be if my select board said, oh, our meeting minute taker is absent, that's an undue hardship. That wouldn't count. But if it was like the only staff, there's no staff available in the whole town, or there's an emergency causing the town building to be shut down, that would count. Does that make sense? Like, it's not something specific to the select, like, I'm trying to think of an example where this would be the case.
I will say that your example makes sense in the context of this amendment, but it is not exclusively that sort of setting. And we're about to get to some of the factors that can be considered.
Okay,
And there's one significant legal shift in the factors. So, significant difficulty or expense in light of factors including the overall size of the entity, the availability of necessary personnel. So previously, this was sufficient personnel. One of the first things that you learn in law school, if I bring you to 1L year, which was torturous for everyone who went to law school, is the difference between necessity and sufficiency.
Yes.
And in this context, necessity is a lower bar for what can be committed to achieving compliance, and for purposes of claiming undue hardship, a higher bar. So provided that you have what is necessary, you cannot claim undue hardship. Sufficiency would be a much higher standard. So to articulate the difference here, if we are talking about a request that a meeting be held virtually, the necessary technology to achieve that is just a camera and an internet connection. It could be a cell phone, it could be a laptop. That might not be sufficient for a high quality connection to see everyone in the room, but it is what is necessary.
We use the owl. We use the owl.
Senator Bykowski.
You have that, did you?
Hesitant to muddy these waters. So it is a lower because you've said both it's lower and higher. And I'm wanting to clarify the standard of necessity is lower in that you may need less to meet it, which actually means for the public body, the standard for it to be an undue hardship is high.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I like it.
And finally, another legal shift here. The final factor that's articulated was the entity's budget. And budget here is replaced with available resources. So it's not strictly what is budgeted for the body, but what is available broadly in the resources that the entity has available to achieve compliance.
Could be a room, could be heat,
It's
could be no electricity.
not exclusively a budgetary analysis.
Right.
Senator Benoist.
And so this seems much clearer to me. It seems like it is doing what we had hoped, what I had hoped to do. I'm speaking of me. And it does seem like the instance of sort of like an emergency is actually not covered here, but is covered in the emergency meeting exceptions. So if the town offices were to burn down,
Yes.
it would not be, I mean, it would be an undue hardship, but it is covered in another place of open meeting.
I'm gonna give myself a note if we can, it comes back to this to double check. I believe that there's also in the undue hardship section, a cross reference to the local emergency.
That's the word, that's the one I was looking for, the local emergency. And that was broader in that it could mean that a meeting, a public body made the decision to have an all remote meeting because a member of the body received a threat.
Yeah.
Or there was no power, or.
And to bring everyone back, this undue hardship standard only comes into play when there is a request for accommodation from a member of the public.
There we go.
Whereas the emergency standard is in a different space where any point there is a local emergency.
Right.
Okay.
This
I
is,
just wanted to clarify, it's been a little while.
thank you.
One VSA 312A, section 312A, not sub A. I believe is the local emergencies provision.
I imagine you're right. I'm not looking, but you're usually right.
I've been wrong many times before.
This is actually, this
Grateful.
This is clearer now. I understand the substantive changes, but it also reads clearer. So I appreciate that.
And I appreciate that it just aligns with existing, like, accommodation law.
That's a, God forbid.
Let's align it with the ADA. It's almost like this work has been done.
If we're ready, section 2 proposes some clarifying amendments to 1 VSA section 312, which is what we call the most operative section of the open meeting law. This is where all of the procedures for meetings are housed. And we're going to move through a couple of quick clarifying amendments. And Senator Hardy touched on it, but largely what this is doing is it's eliminating the use of an undefined term in the text of the open meeting law and in the section headings. That was, it was added by the House. It did pass the entire General Assembly. So it was also passed by the Senate. I just
So
want
Senator
to,
Hardy can
Give it up for the House.
I want to make sure that the entire General Assembly knows that they are cared for. If you join me on page 3, the first instance is in that subdivision A3, striking the term non-advisory. Non-advisory is not a defined term. It was added in the House for purposes of clarity around the subdivision, but ultimately what it did is it suddenly broke the understanding of this section of the open meeting law into 4 categories: state advisory, state non-advisory, local non-advisory. And it made it somewhat complicated to navigate this section, trying to track what was applicable. And originally this was just 2 forms: all public bodies, and then the accepted group, advisory bodies, who did not have legislative, quasi-judicial, taxing, or budgetary authority.
The committee may recall Senator White and I getting quite confused trying to discuss the non-advisory committees. This fixes that.
Yes. For the state.
It gets rid of the non-advisory, because it was confusing because non-advisory actually has more power than advisory. You may recall you and I had a lengthy
Yes.
discussion about this. It gets rid of it.
Yes, but for I'm sorry, okay.
Anywhere where the term non-advisory appeared, it has been struck, and it has either just been struck and thrown away or replaced with a general term.
Public body.
Oh, okay. I misread that. I was reading that, line 7 through 9. Okay. Okay, so it is everybody.
But it's
Okay.
not substantively, it changes nothing of the
It's-
definition.
yeah.
It simply
Okay.
is clearer, I would say, than adding the non-advisory
So,
language.
so it's advisory or public bodies? Kind of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that is a lot simpler.
The initial confusion that came up in this context with trying to have a carve out group that is still subject to the open meeting law is that advisory bodies are still public bodies. They are just public bodies that don't exercise one of those 4 core powers.
Okay. Beautiful.
I thought we only had one core power.
Taxing.
Oh, right, taxing.
Legislative, quasi judicial, taxation, or budgetary.
Right.
And I will note for your future conversations, because you've already discussed it this session, that it is that last piece, the budgetary authority, that many of the organizations that Senator Collmore called out at the beginning of this meeting are captured by.
Right.
But for clarity, budgetary means actually voting on a budget, not setting aside a special committee to give advice on a budget, but actually voting on the budget. So if I were a school board, I'm captured as a full public body. But if my school board were to say have a budgeted committee that worked out what they were going to advise the school board as to the budget, that is an advisory committee.
Yes.
Correct. I believe I followed you all the way through the thread, and I'm going to try to boil this down to a simple statement. Public body has control, final control over the budget. They're captors and are a public body. They are not an advisory body.
But a public body can be broken down into advisory bodies. So the school board as a whole, public body, but the subcommittees could be advisory.
Give us a recommendation on the budget. Yes.
Thank you.
Senator White?
Thank you, Mr. Okay, similar thought pattern, but with quasi judicial. So I believe that some of the land use planning pieces that we heard from folks who are serving on the board, they are quasi judicial because of that. I think I don't know if that's their side of it, but we heard that with the land use planning folks that they believe technically if they had even a small group of themselves, that they would have to be meeting, but they aren't. It's only when the final board is meeting, even if they're meeting in like a subgroup to talk about plans, or is that quasi judicial? I don't know.
I would
Help me out.
recommend that for the quasi judicial pieces, we table that for a deeper discussion of the open meeting law broadly, because
Okay.
there are already quite a few exemptions built into the open meeting law for all public bodies, when they are a quasi judicial body and when they are holding deliberations in relation to the quasi judicial matter. This is perhaps overbroad description, but if a public body is the arbiter of a case or controversy, or as the Administrative Procedures Act calls it, a contested case, it is likely that they are quasi judicial.
The word is a quasi judicial body.
You read my mind, Senator Clarkson.
I know where you're going.
I'm trying to understand because I think some of the flags that we've received for concerns on why people may want to get an exemption is because of the lack of clarity specifically on this division. So I appreciate that we are clarifying this language, not only because I think it makes more sense to me, but I hope it helps lawyers all around who may represent those areas have some clarity too. If that's just a statement I'm making. No comment needed.
Lawyers love help.
And like,
So
Probably clarity.
That's also one.
you'll note on lines 13 and 14 of page 3 that there's quite a bit of material that is struck out. And what is happening here is that all of that language was describing what is in subdivisions 3 and 4. So it was descriptive language built around a cross-reference, but it was a little cumbersome to move through. So that language is struck and the cross-references to subdivisions 3 and 4 are left in there. So that this first sentence is a little easier to read and hopefully follow. Moving into section 3 on page 4. And we're going to lead right into page 5 here. You got the overview of this. This is adding a basis for a motion to go into executive session. So sure that you are all familiar from your time in public service. A public body may go into a closed executive session based on a motion. And the motion has to be tied to, under the open meeting law, one of the articulated bases for entering executive session. This would add a new basis for going into executive session to discuss information relating to the interest rates for publicly financed loans. Based on the conversation you've had before about some of the financially adjacent public bodies that exist, there is an existing basis for going into executive session to discuss any information or records that is confidential under the Public Records Act. So if you're reviewing a document that is exempt from the Public Records Act, you can go into executive session to review that material as a public body and then come back out, if you're going to vote on the issue related to that underlying document. And there are many bases for confidentiality and exemption in the Public Records Act relating to confidential financial information. So it would be worth exploring that.
Senator Clark.
So there are many more confidential financial discussions other than loans.
Mhm.
You could be discussing where you're investing a town endowment, or you could be, I can think of a number of other financial discussions that would perhaps be discussing different rates or different returns on investment, or things that were similar to interest rates. Why are we not? Could this be interpreted, or could we add to it? We can always add.
I can't comment on the policy, and if the committee wants to explore,
But this
broader
wouldn't cover that.
confidentiality for some other financial matters, it's certainly something that you can add to some executive sessions. It's less
But this isn't designed to cover all financial rights,
just
because some financial matters absolutely should be discussed publicly.
I listened to some of your previous discussions about open meeting law challenges, and one thing that I do want to note is another way to address some of these concerns around the open meeting law isn't necessarily within the open meeting law. It might be within the statutes governing those types of public bodies to determine whether those are actually the types of duties and work that are appropriate for a consensus making body to be doing versus something that an executive officer would be doing. Day-to-day operations, executing certain discrete financial decisions. When you have a public body doing that, they have to abide by the open meeting law. But many structures in state government assign those duties to an inferior officer that does that discrete work and then provides recommendations and decision points to the body.
Senator Austin.
So I do have a question for you, but I do think Senator Clarkson that some of the things you are pointing out, I'm glad it doesn't cover things like discussing interest rates and interest returns and where a fund might be. But the public should know where a town is investing their endowment or where we might be investing our pension to make sure that we agree with those choices.
But I actually see that there could be competitive rates. I mean, in the way that the interest rate discussion is a competitive financial thing, I could see that would be. Anyway,
It's worth a conversation, but I'm glad at this point that doesn't hurt. My question for you. So we have one other board that does have a deliberative meeting exemption. And if there are, so actually, but they're all in line. If we were to have other boards that similarly were full-time boards, would that be an alternative way to capture this narrow exemption for if you're planning the agenda, you don't need to screen that?
Yes.
Okay.
Allowing for deliberations as defined in one BSA 310 of a particular type of public body or a specific public body to be held outside of the open meeting law is one way to tackle that.
And the other way you're suggesting is potentially changing the duties of the public body and potentially either taking away or but fundamentally changing that public body.
Adjusting the structure, sure.
Okay.
So allowing, for example, the delegation of certain duties to an executive officer that serves the board,
Okay. And then
not necessarily decision-making power.
yes.
But instead the duty to carry out the actual day-to-day functions, so that you avoid some of the concerns and issues around how are we actually supposed to do this work? We would have to be holding an open meeting for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Right. And then, so my other question to that too, we've already determined that a subset of a board that is doing advisory work can fall under the advisory committee. Now, if we were talking about a board that said this committee is going to go advise on the agenda, would that then mean that that subset of the board can follow the advisory committee rules, even if they have a quorum?
Provided that they have discrete assigned duties and that they have a quorum. Yes.
Okay.
Now, the sidecar note there is that public body is also capable of having less than a quorum of its members carry out specific duties and not be subject to the open meeting law. So if it was this particular committee, the chair could ask you and Senator White to tackle some specific issue and come back and report to the entire committee. And the two of you do not constitute a quorum of a public body, so you could carry out that work and come back to report.
A great point.
Well, and I guess my follow-up to that is, say this committee, bad example, because we're not actually, but anyways, we're to say Senator Clarkson, Senator White, and myself, we're going to go do some advising work and come back and report. Would that group, even though it's a quorum of the whole, still be an advisory committee?
So the way that the definition of public body breaks down is that subcommittees, formally created subcommittees, are also captured by the open meeting law. And yes, if you were only given advisory duties and you did not have decision-making capacity over legislative, quasi-judicial, taxation, or budgetary matters, you would fall under the definition of an advisory body.
Thank you.
Hey,
Please
there we
appoint
go.
ASAP.
That needs
Right.
that needs to go out as a bulletin. So lawyers for this.
Because I actually think that piece captures the concern we have been hearing, is that you absolutely can be together as a forum of the whole if you have been given specific charges as a subcommittee to be under an advisory committee, and you are not then having to stream 24/7.
Now, I will say, and please, Senator Collmore, stop me if I'm going too deep in the analysis and discussion now, that not all public bodies have been given express authority to create subcommittees, which could be some of the concern here, which is what I was talking about with perhaps some of the issues are solved more in the originating acts around these public bodies than in the open meeting law. And we do sometimes call out expressly, you are permitted to make the following subcommittees. So it's something for the assembly to keep in mind moving forward when you're creating some state agencies, boards and committees is if you think they might need to create subcommittees to tackle discrete issues, give them the authority to create subcommittees.
That is quite helpful.
Any other questions for Tucker? Okay,
Can I just advocate that we take this bill up? This is, I'm putting in my bid that we should take this bill up.
I think we are taking it. This is taken up.
Okay, but for a committee bill, if that's what we're.
Oh, is it committee bill?
Wait, let's use this bill.
Why can't we just use 59?
I don't know. just
Ruth
let me
gave
know.
it to us as a vehicle.
Great, okay.
It didn't have a big bow on top, but
It was a gift.
okay, Tucker, thank you.
Thank you all.
We're gonna move right along to our next,
Like Dungeons and Dragons, local government.
no. We'll be only today.
Oh my God, I'm so happy you're here.
Are you now?
Yeah, I didn't to see you twice in one day.
Well,
This is obviously about the
You want me to
knives.
pass? I'm happy to do it.
The knives bill.
Thank you, dear.
It's not.
unfortunately.
It's so nice to have Sophie in morning and afternoon. This is great.
Can't get away from me.
So we'll begin to talk about S58 and act related to requirements for the pay plans of certain law enforcement officers and firefighters employed by the state. And the village sponsor is with us, Senator Pat Brennan. And welcome. First of all, I think you know everybody, so we don't have to go around the room for the introductions. If you could just sort of tell us the genesis of this, how it came about, and then we have counsel in the room to actually walk us through the bill at some point.
Yes, thank you. For the record, Senator Pat Brennan, Grand Island County. I am here today to talk about S58. It's a bill that I had introduced in the House previously, and I think it's been around for quite some time. I'm going to read from a prepared statement here, which kind of explains it pretty well. It's complicated. So the Group C retirement system was originally created by the legislature for Vermont state troopers in 1996. It included a mandatory retirement age of 55 with 20 years of service. In 2001, we recognized that all other state sworn law enforcement officers, including state firefighters, that is a whole different, should fall under the same Group C retirement system. So the law was modified. This allowed all sworn state law enforcement, state firefighters employed after the law change to be in Group C, which is a 20-year retirement system. In 2005, 2006, the STEP pay plan was added to the Vermont State Police contract, allowing the ability to reach the maximum pay step within the 20-year retirement window. So all employees covered by the NMU, that's a
no management unit.
non-management unit contract, except for sworn law enforcement officers, which is approximately 2% of that group, do not have mandatory age retirement and are eligible to retire after 30 years. So the pay chart for the NMU contract is structured to allow maximization in year 24 and a half, 5 years prior to the 30-year retirement group. I should mention that all these people that were put in Group C came from Group F.
Right.
It's complicated, but
Right. We moved them to.
yeah, if you decide to take the bill up, you can get into all this. So I'm learning as I go through it. So, but this allows for someone to reach that maximum step 5 years prior to retirement, 5.5 years or 4.5 years, I should say, prior to retirement. In contrast,
The step is the pay scale.
yes,
It's the amount of money.
yeah.
Okay.
And I think there are 15 steps that you reach for your maximum retirement. So in contrast, the Vermont State Police contract is structured to maximize in 14 and a half years. So these folks were lumped into Group C with the state police contract in the same group, but they don't reach their maximum step until 24 and a half years have gone by. And I'm looking at Sophie, and correct me if I misspeak. She's been over this with me. We're learning together, I think, on this one. So that's 11 years faster than the rest of the Group C retirement. And I won't delve any deeper into it, but I'll read this. Group C, state law enforcement and state firefighters, excluding Vermont State Police, are the only union contracted employees in the state that cannot achieve step 15 level of income within their retirement window. So you would ask, how many does that include? This group that I mentioned is about 100 employees out of 6,000 who cannot fully retire with full benefits in that group.
Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for explaining the complex side of that and like how it all works. But the bottom line, if I'm understanding correctly, is that there's a group of folks who are union contract workers who qualify for everything in Group C, which is kind of our group of people who do extremely hard, dangerous, or like difficult work. Essentially, don't know if there's a specific way to word that. There's a group of folks within that, although they're totally a part of the full category otherwise, that don't get paid the full amount that they could if they just happen to be one of the other jobs.
Yeah.
So they're overall making less money before they retire for really no apparent good reason. Is that like no merit-based or quality of that job reason? Or it's clerical? I guess I'm not really understanding why it just happens that they got missed, right?
No, they were,
I guess I don't fully understand the problem that we're solving, other than there's a group of people who
I
are
think
totally deserving of making the full amount of money, but they cannot just
Yeah.
because they have to retire by law, like they have to retire at that age before they get hit.
Right.
Okay.
And by retiring at that age, this group doesn't reach step 15 in that time frame.
Yeah, like they couldn't.
They can't.
Yeah, you would be. Yeah. Thank you. That makes sense.
And I just have become familiar with it in the last week, so I've been looking at it too. So Senator Byhowski.
This bill is specific to police officers, though. It does not cover all of our unionized state workers that do difficult, dangerous jobs.
It would be expensive, difficult, dangerous, and it just covers the state employees in that Group C under state police, DMV enforcement,
Liquor and lottery.
These are people who are sworn law enforcement officers under those,
And fire.
and firefighters and wardens.
And good civil servants. I mean,
I appreciate that, and it would be really interesting to look at the pay scales of all of those people in addition to some of the other people doing difficult, dangerous jobs.
Does anyone else have a question for Senator Brennan? We'll let him get back to another.
can I ask one other question?
Sure.
Which is, I really appreciate this bill, actually. We had talked vaguely about it, but
and we've actually talked about it in the past.
yeah, in your community pass. One thing that surprises me is the Department of Liquor and Lottery enforcement folks. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't necessarily see them being in dangerous situations, right? Like,
Well,
let me they're normally what I believe they do is they go to a bar and they make sure that there's proper signage or that they have DRAM insurance. And it's more of like a regulatory check. They're not going in and like performing like busts. They're not arresting people. I don't know. I guess I really don't know.
They don't arrest, well, they can, they have powers,
Oh,
those powers, and they are armed.
wow.
Yeah, I think we'd have to hear from DM.
Yeah.
Yeah,
maybe
you'd
I
have
would
to
ask the thing.
hear about the average daily life of all of these folks, but I would rather be a game warden than a liquor and lottery enforcement. agency.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, I guess I would love to hear from them. I don't know what they do. I thought I did and I don't.
But we could certainly call people in. I think you captured the gist of it though, Senator Brass. They pay the same amount of money into the system, but they're,
Yes.
because of the time limit and the contraction of the state police situation where they have to go more quickly, these folks kind of are left out of that,
So-
what would be a normal process.
And I would add one more thing, in looking, I think Sophie found it, in the 120 or 112 page NMU contract, and on page 62 at the bottom, there is formed a study committee of 4 and 4 for state,
Four for each side, so.
4 for each side. That will, according to the language in the contract, get together and talk about this. And having talked to VSEA, chiefs today, they don't believe that's been done.
When was that enacted?
It's in the current contract.
It's in the current contract. It expires in 2026.
June 2026.
So they have a few months.
A year. Yeah,
Good to.
But we
Okay.
could light the fire under their tuckuses to do that. If it hasn't been, I mean, we can do that.
Well, it's a union contract.
I know, but we could ask lots of good questions and get that.
Okay.
you might, yeah, that would be a good question to ask because I was told, I think I was told, right, that the union, folks that are in the building can't get involved in conversations about that, nor can the administration.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming it might be up to us. He'll quote me on that. I don't know.
We can often go places other people can't.
Can't. That's true.
Thank you, Senator Brennan. We appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having.
Sophie, you're welcome to join us.
I'm gonna ditch you. I'm gonna be back there. Thanks.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Thank
Do you know everybody? I think.
you. I've been,
Senator Larry Hart,
very nice to
Orange
meet you.
County.
So Sophie Sadowny for the Office of Legislative Counsel, and I think you all understand it, but it definitely is complicated. So I think just to Senator Wojciechowski's point about other people that do dangerous work, I think the issue here is that you've got a group of people that are required to retire by a certain age. They're on a step plan that takes them a really long time to get to the maximum benefit. And the other folks that have to retire by a certain age, are on an accelerated schedule. And if you look at the 2-step pay plans for the Vermont State Police, it's basically 1 year per step. Whereas if you look at the state employees under the non-management unit, some of the steps are 2-3 years, and that's why it's so much longer. So they're both 15-step plans, but they just take a lot longer. And so I think that's exactly the issue. It's just they're kind of caught. Their pay scale is under this one, and their retirement is under a different one. So it's not aligned.
Senator Flexion.
So remind me, Sophie. Steps are not automatic. You don't automatically just proceed to the next step. You have to be promoted.
It depends on the contract. Typically with a step pay plan, you are automatically, regardless of, unless you're doing an absolutely terrible job. What was it?
Regardless of your annual review or if you're any good.
Right. Yeah, that's the difference. A step pay plan is, lockstep moving up versus sort of a merit pay approach.
We like this. Step pay plans are very good for workers. Very, very good.
Why don't I suggest we walk through the bill and then if there are questions as we go through, we can do that. I do have some other questions, but I'll certainly wait till we're through with the language.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, yeah, so it's short. This would be creating a new section. And it's specifically focused again on those law enforcement officers, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Liquor and Lottery, Department of Motor Vehicles, and also firefighters employed by the state of Vermont. So those are the folks that are impacted under the current way that it works. And what this is doing is really sort of requiring that there be a step pay plan that permits those folks to be able to get to the highest step for their applicable pay grade. And in this, they have it achieving in 18 years and 6 months of service. And as Senator Brennan said, for other folks, it's sort of 14 and a half years for the Vermont State Police,
Right.
under the, the way that the current pay plan they're under, it's more like 20, 23, 24 years. And then there is language relating to the collective bargaining agreement. So on page 2, subsection B is saying there's nothing in this section which would prevent the state and any collective bargaining representative for those units in terms of talking through in the negotiation process, the number of steps in a pay plan, the time in each step, and any conditions required to advance between the steps. So it leaves up to the parties to sort of work those details out. And then it has section 2 is transitional provisions. And this goes to the fact that right now they're under a contract that started in July of last year and there's a 2-year contract, runs through to June of 26. And so this is saying that, language just to provide for that transition. So firefighters and law enforcement officers whose pay plan on January 1 of 2025, so this year, doesn't meet the requirements, they should be transitioned to a new plan by July of this year. And then the goal is to get everybody aligned. And then they're also looking at that when they move to a new step pay plan, that they'd be moved up a step. So if they were at step 11, they'd be moved to step 12 automatically. And then the last section, B on page 3, is saying that the state would engage in impact negotiations. So again, sort of following up on the conversation that you just had with Senator Brennan, if a law were to be passed that's inconsistent with the current contract, what happens is the parties have to come together to do impact bargaining over how that law would impact their current contracts.
Okay, Senator White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Council Fanny, for going through this. I just had 2 questions. Do you know how many people this impacts?
I do not.
100. I think
This,
Plus or minus 100?
yeah, and I think the number that Senator Brennan gave you was actually from several years ago when this first came up. So I would think as a committee, you might want to have
It's
some,
not
I'm going to give you
that
that.
many.
Right. And it's not hundreds and hundreds, but in terms of the current number, yeah.
Maybe we'd say 100 is greater than probably. And then did we ever do a fiscal note on this or how much money it will cost? Because this would, I'm assuming this could have if you're in this situation, and I can understand why people who are in this situation feel strongly about making the change, this could be thousands of dollars. And especially if you're nearing retirement, we've got folks who are coming up on retirement, and I would hate for us. The only urgency I feel with this bill is the fact that we have a lot of good civil servants who are missing out on
Well,
a
the
real
big impact
opportunity
is
for
what they
retirement.
have in retirement in their pension.
Okay, but yeah, how much money is this? It could be pretty significant.
So, a joint fiscal office is aware of the bill. I will say that, my understanding is that when the change was made for the Vermont State Police, there was also an attempt made to kind of retrospectively sort of fix it.
True.
They haven't actually asked for that here, I think, other than the going up by one additional step when, if this were to be enacted. So they're really trying to look at this prospectively.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah,
So-
that was my understanding as well, is that they're not asking for retroactivity on this. They're saying from this point forward, this is the new landscape, if you will. And I'm sympathetic to the fiscal impact as well, Senator White. I assume it will be, but it's going to involve pensions
Yes.
as well as weekly or however they get paid, bi-weekly paychecks. So that's one consideration.
That's actually, I think the main motivation is that they end up with a greater, they end up with because your pension's based on your last income. And that would mean you get to a higher last income before your pension is set. And so it actually, I think the main motivating reason for this is for a fairer and more equitable pension.
Well, also, I think there's a sense of they're paying in, but because of the mandatory retirement age, they never can get to the point to maximize their retirement,
Right.
which other employees can.
Right.
And I know Senator Majowski has a question, but I'll just ask. It feels like we're getting in the middle of what would be a contract negotiating pool. In other words, I want everybody that's listening and hearing to know I'm totally in favor of making our current situation more equitable. But I don't know that this is the right way to do it. I'll just say that right off. To me, it seems like it would be an element of collective bargaining. And apparently this group hasn't met yet. Because I'll say this, so now we've taken care of liquor and lottery and the DMV and all those people. And then someone else says to us, well, wait a minute, I'm a state employee and you should make it a law that I'm gonna, I realize it's limited to just group C. But the argument could be made that once you open the door for the legislature to get involved with what in essence is contract negotiations, I don't know where that could end up. So I'll just say that, and I want to support it. I totally understand how I would feel if I was working for liquor and lottery and I see kind of my brothers and sisters moving up the ladder faster, and I'm trying my best to catch up, and I just, in the current situation, I can't.
I appreciate that. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about pay equity, we need to have a much larger conversation than this one. I think we have plenty of people who work in dangerous jobs. In fact, the last state employee that was killed in the line of duty was a social worker who
Fair
was
enough.
paid significantly less at their base salary than police officers.
Fair
So I think if we're gonna have a conversation about pay equity, we're opening up a much bigger conversation about pay equity.
Okay.
And putting on my hat on the pension oversight committee, I would definitely want to be looking at like, we just got our pensions in a healthy spot. So I think it would be a big conversation about the pension impact.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this conversation has been happening even before that. I mean, this has been a long-term burr under the saddle of the firefighters and the other people involved. So, in all fairness, this has been going on for a while, and I would disagree with you because this involves, I don't know, this also involves state pensions. I mean, that's the big piece here. I mean, it involves, we have made all the different pension plan transitions and changes we have done in this committee.
Understood, but
So I
somehow,
don't know why this would be different.
one of the provisions here, if I remember reading it, is that if there's a new contract, it doesn't negate, you know what I'm saying? We're in the middle sort of land that I'm not sure we want to walk on.
Well, and to your other point, this little subcommittee that hasn't yet met. I kind of like
Oh, I
them to
don't- yeah.
get their
I think
act together and meet.
that's a consideration. I wish that they would meet this week with a new contract, and then we could put this aside and everything would get fixed. But I don't know that that's gonna happen.
But I don't want to necessarily preempt their work. I mean, that's one thought. On the other hand,
Yeah, page 2, nothing in this section shall be construed to prevent the state and any collective bargaining representative employed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, et cetera, from determining through collective bargaining the number of steps in the pay plan. So we almost feel like I'm on hold waiting for something else to happen kind of thing. But you're right, there is a direct correlation to the pension over which we do have jurisdiction.
and which is how we have waited before in moving other groups. Remember, we did sheriffs last year.
Yeah.
So we just did this last year.
Yes, Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just say, I really appreciate you explaining this again and giving us more detail, but personally, I would love us to have real consideration for this bill. I understand there's a lot of bigger conversations that could be had about this. I think incrementally this could improve potentially the retirement for some really, really high quality civil servants. And I do have no assurances that this will change organically on its own through a contract process. That's kind of where I'm seeing it. I think if you are wanting them to make that happen, the best way that we can accelerate that is probably inviting the right people in to give testimony. So I'm wondering if you would be open to us scheduling testimony from some of the people impacted by this.
Sure.
And possibly, I'd love if you have ideas for who appropriate witnesses would be, but
The FDA.
Yep, this bill there's been a few different flag waivers on this bill. I know Pat had it on that. We haven't seen it necessarily in the Senate because he usually introduced it in the House. So, I think
Well,
it'd
we've
be
looked at it
interesting
here.
for us to do it on our side, but.
Yeah, I don't think anybody in the room denies the fact that what is currently existing could be improved
Okay.
on the on the part of the 100 or however many there are. It's just a question of in what way do we do that? And while I'm sympathetic to your point, Senator Bynofsky, maybe it's sort of better at this point to take each individual piece of this separately. And I mean, we could be here for 4 weeks talking about everybody that works in state government, I suppose.
I agree, and I think systemically, fields that are predominated by women tend to get left behind in the conversation around pay equity. And so I think if we're going to open up a conversation about pay equity, we should do our due diligence to make sure we are opening up the bigger conversation. Like, I would be curious to see what the average pension of the different law enforcement are versus the average pension of a DCF worker versus the average pension of a nurse at the Berlin, places where I know workers are getting assaulted daily, and look at pay equity. So I'm hesitant, and I don't know this because I haven't looked at it in a while, to address pay equity in a group of people that is likely already making more than a group of people who is experiencing danger on in their job and is not. And so if we're going to tackle it bit by bit, I would suggest we start at the bottom and tackle it with the people who are already systematically placed behind.
Okay.
You had a group C bill, someone had another group C bill with social workers at one point, like to add them.
So I have a bill this year. You may recall a similar conversation exploded a little bit in this committee last year when there was a suggestion that we add additional police officers into the death benefits bill.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And I will have a bill, hopefully, it might have even been introduced on the floor today, but I wasn't there. That would allow death benefits to that whole group that I brought up last year that I just named, child protection workers.
So that's coming.
That's coming.
I would definitely consider putting those two conversations together.
But I think if we're truly talking pay equity, like I imagine if we went and looked at the average pension of any of the state law enforcement, it is significantly higher than our DCF and nurses that are getting assaulted literally every day.
Don't disagree with you on that.
And I realize so we're sort of degenerate, but it's nice of you to listen.
You're such a good listener.
I'm just.
Oh,
curious.
and look there.
Oh, and Mr. Labor himself.
You're too kind.
I'm just curious, because we're talking about our work maybe possibly preempting the work that the contract has requested to be done. Was there a provision in previous contracts to get that work done? And no, so this is new.
That's
Okay, because I thought, wow, maybe they've had contracts year after year or every couple of years after every couple of years requesting this work and it hasn't been done. And if that hadn't been done, then I would say then it is time for us to act. But if it's newish.
Well, from what I looked at the previous one, so from what I can tell is this is the language is new to the current
Okay,
contract.
good, because then there's more.
Yeah, and it's the state and the VSA will establish a joint study committee consisting of 4 representatives from the state, 4 representatives from VSEA to discuss methods and funding to extend the state police lieutenant's pay plan to bargaining unit members who currently are required to retire by the age of 55 and in the Group C retirement plan. This is the provision.
Thank you.
So there isn't a deadline or saying you have to do it, but it's study committee, so, which I know
And
the
you're not
legislature is
there.
familiar with.
Well, I don't know whether you would know anyway, but I don't think it's happened.
Right, only from what Senator Brannan said that he had talked this morning to VSEA folks in the building and the sense I got was it hasn't kicked off yet.
Yeah.
So again, the contract would have gone into effect last summer. So I don't know if they have a plan to do it soon, but.
Okay, so more to come, I guess, right? I think we'll be talking about this for a little bit, and maybe I'm a little overly sensitive to sort of treading through. I don't want to say stepping through the tulips, that's kind of silly, but I think we need to be
There's a song
careful
there.
about where our jurisdiction is
Yeah.
and where the contract negotiations, which we don't have anything really to do with. I'm hoping that group gets together and obviates the need to,
We should get your question answered though. I mean, I feel like it's with Beth Fastigi or is that the right?
Or maybe,
Well, other than the union, is there someone who represents the employer
who
would
are
be
the four charged to get
to
together?
discuss?
Who is in that committee that's charged to get together?
I don't know who the individuals are. It just says 4 people from the state and 4 people from VSEA.
So I would recommend, actually, depending on what, if we want to take action or not, or if we are tending to think that's our action would preempt their work. I would suggest maybe we, Jeanette used to write those letters. I think it might be a letter writing time to both sides saying, we're waiting to write
the progress company.
yeah, how's progress? Otherwise, we're sending them up to the gap period to settle. So we await your work on this. Because the best work is organically done where both sides can come to agreement, and I always think that's the best way to get things resolved.
Well, obviously it won't be tomorrow. We have our joint meeting in the House Education or House GovOps Committee, but maybe next week, or we still have the week after we get back to. And if there's something in the House that's,
There isn't
There isn't.
anything that I'm aware of.
Okay.
perhaps.
well, then I guess that's in our.
That's moved here.
And if we're gonna write a letter, I would really ask that we direct those meeting to address the larger issue of pay equity.
Okay, sure, for sure.
Okay,
I like that.
Like, I'm not opposed to this idea. I just want to make sure that we're looking at the broad picture.
Pay equity.
Pay equity, imagine that.
Oh, I imagine it all the time in Senate Economic Development.
Well, that's just the problem, is that we're only imagining it.
Correct.
We're not realizing it.
We are trying to realize it. One bill at a time.
thank you, Sophie. We
Thank you
appreciate your
very
time.
much.
Thank you. It's, I think your first time in this.
It
committee.
is.
Oh,
yes.
It's great to have you. I am lucky enough to get Sophie off in the morning.
Okay. Let's take the next scheduled witnesses until 3, and we're gonna begin talking about the Act or S64, the ISO bill, if you will. And we have 4, I think maybe, yeah. And then we have one thing to do after that before we adjourn today. So let's say 15 minute break, and we'll be back at